Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Rukhsana Rahman. From the Department of Women's Studies. I will be speaking on UNHRC's Guidelines on the Protection of Refugee Women, 1991. This discussion focuses on how conflict effectively displaces women in the conflict zone, people as a whole, and also it focuses light on how women face problems that is much different from men in the relief camps. It also focuses on how the growing awareness of the international agencies for the special needs for women and displaced women. This lecture is divided between many modules, and this is the first module, and this discusses on the various sections of the protection of the guidelines on the protection of the refugee woman 1991. It also discusses the guidelines in the context of India and also legal provision of it. The UNHCR claims, I quote, "We work to ensure that everybody has the right to seek asylum and find safe refuge, having fled violence, persecution, war or disaster at home. Since 1950, we have faced multiple crises on multiple continents and provided vital assistance to refugees, asylum seekers, internally displaced and stateless people, many of whom have nobody left to turn to. We help to save lives and build better futures for millions forced from home." The Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, also known as the United Nations Refugee Agency, is a United Nations program mandated to protect and support refugees at the request of a government or the United Nations itself and assist in their voluntary repatriation, local integration or resettlement to a third country. Its headquarters are in Geneva, Switzerland, and is a member of the United Nations Development Group. The UNHCR has won 2 Nobel Peace Prizes, once in 1954 and again in 1981. Conflicts are often driven by racial, ethnic, religious, or political divisions, because of which more than 5 lakhs people are affected every year all over the world. The magnitude of this problem can be assessed if one looks at the case of Sudan. Sudan is considered to be one of the most war-torn parts of the world. Currently, the quote, "South Sudanese population at large is bearing the brunt of the conflict, with some 1.4 million of people uprooted by the end of 2014. Over half of the population of Sudan are displaced and depends on humanitarian aid. This requires the active role of international organizations for the rehabilitation of the affected people in the camps. War, communal and ethnic conflicts affect the local population, specifically the women, as it displaces them from their private spaces. People, irrespective of gender, are affected by the violence unleashed by conflict, but women and girls are at higher risk because of their status in the society and their sex. While looking into the history, after the end of the Second War, with lakhs of people homeless and displaced, the International Refugee Organization IRO was founded by the United Nations in 1947. Before its establishment, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration had been created in the year 1944, was replaced by International Refugee Organization. This was the first time that an international agency had been established to deal holistically with the refugee problem. The IRO was again replaced, and in its place, a new body called the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugee was founded, a subsidiary organ of the General Assembly in December 1949, to function for a period of 3 years starting from the year 1951. UNHCR's mandate was originally set out in its statute annexed to Resolution 428-5 of the United Nations General Assembly of 1950. After 3 years, it was supposed to be disbanded, but since the problem of refugees and internally displaced persons has only increased, this mandate has been subsequently broadened by numerous resolutions of the General Assembly and its Economic and Social Council. And the UNHCR is now one of the most important organizations of the United Nations. The mandate of the UNHCR is to provide, on a non-political and humanitarian basis, international protection to refugees and to seek permanent solutions to them. The refugee problem has assumed a global face. Hungary, Hong Kong, and the Algerian refugees in Tunisia and Morocco all have needed the services of the UNHCR. In the 1960s, there were a large number of people displaced from their homes and refugee status in Africa as the continent underwent steady unrest and civil disruption in many of the countries, in its especially Sudan. With the urgent requirement of aid and other kinds of help, including rehabilitation, the attention of the UNHCR became focused on its part of the world, unlike times when it was almost completely Europe-centric. In the following decade, as for example in the 1970s, the new nation of Bangladesh was born. During its flight of independence, masses of people from East Pakistan moved into India, creating a whole range of problems, many of which India still continues to grapple with. Further, East was the country of Vietnam, where the war had caused thousands to flee their country and seek refuge in their nations. In the 1980s, these migrations, caused not just by war, but also by clashes between different ethnic groups, affected the countries where the refugees had gone. Further complexities were added to the situations due to hostilities and rivalries among the rich nations.
In the summer of 2015, Europe experienced the highest influx of refugees since the Second World War. Why? The main reason is that Syria has become the world's top source of refugees. Syria is located in the Middle East, an ancient, fertile land settled for at least 10,000 years. Since the 1960s, it's been led by the al-Assad family, who have ruled it as quasi-dictators until the Arab Spring happened in 2011, a revolutionary wave of protests and conflicts in the Arab world that toppled many authoritarian regimes. But the Assads refused to step down and started a brutal civil war. Different ethnicities and religious groups fought each other in changing coalitions. ISIS, a militaristic jihadist group, used the opportunity and entered the chaos with the goal to build a totalitarian Islamic caliphate. Very quickly, it became one of the most violent and successful extremist organizations on earth. All sides committed horrible war crimes using chemical weapons, mass executions, torture on a large scale, and repeated deadly attacks on civilians. The Syrian population was trapped between the regime, rebel groups, and the religious extremists. A third of the Syrian people have been displaced within Syria, while over 4 million have fled the country. The vast majority of them reside now in camps in the neighboring countries, who are taking care of 95% of the refugees, while the Arab states of the Persian Gulf together have accepted 0 Syrian refugees, which has been called especially shameful by Amnesty International. The UN and the World Food Programme were not prepared for a refugee crisis on this scale. As a result, many refugee camps are crowded and undersupplied, subjecting people to cold, hunger, and disease. The Syrians lost hope that their situation will be getting better anytime soon, so many decided to seek asylum in Europe. Between 2007 and 2014, the European Union had invested about €2 billion into fences, high-tech security technology and border patrols, but not a lot in preparation for an influx of refugees. So it was badly prepared for the storm of asylum seekers. In the EU, a refugee has to stay in the state they arrived in first, which put enormous pressure on the border states that were already in trouble. Greece, in the midst of an economic crisis on the scale of the Great Depression, was not able to take care of so many people at once, leading to terrible scenes of desperate, hungry people on islands usually reserved for tourists. The world needed to come together and act as a united front, but instead it has become more divided. Many states downright refused to take in any refugees, leaving the border states alone in their struggle. In 2014, the UK lobbied to stop a huge search and rescue operation called Mare Nostrum that was designed to stop asylum seekers from drowning in the Mediterranean. The idea seems to have been that a higher death toll on the sea would mean fewer asylum seekers trying to make the journey. But of course, in reality, that's not what happened. The perception of the crisis around the world suddenly changed when photos circulated of a dead boy from Syria found lying face down on a beach in Turkey. Germany announced that it will, without exception, accept all Syrian refugees and is now preparing to take in 800,000 people in 2015. More than the entire EU took in 2014, only to impose temporary border controls a few days later and demand an EU-wide solution. All over the West, more and more people are beginning to take action, although support for asylum seekers has mostly come from citizens, not from politicians. But there are fears in the Western world: Islam, high birth rates, crime and the collapse of the social systems. Let's acknowledge this and look at the facts. Even if the EU alone were to accept all 4 million Syrian refugees and 100% of them were Muslims, the percentage of Muslims in the European Union would only rise from about 4% to about 5%. This is not a drastic change and will certainly not make it a Muslim continent. A Muslim minority is neither new nor reason to be afraid. Birth rates in many parts of the Western world are low, so some fear asylum seekers might overtake the native population in a few decades. Studies have shown that even though birth rates are higher among Muslims in Europe, they drop and adjust as the standard of living and level of education rises. Most Syrian refugees already are educated. The birth rate in Syria before the civil war was not very high, and the population was actually shrinking, not growing. The fear that refugees lead to higher crime rates also turns out to be wrong. Refugees who become immigrants are less likely to commit crimes than the native population. When allowed to work, they tend to start businesses and integrate themselves into the workforce as fast as possible, paying more into the social systems than they extract from them.
Solutions became more and more difficult to find, and the UNHCR became deeply involved in these issues. UNHCR's Guidelines on the Protection of Refugee Women 1991 follows. I quote, UNHCR's Executive Committee has acknowledged that while forcibly displaced men and boys also face protection problems, women and girls can be exposed to particular protection problems related to their gender, their cultural and socio-economic position, and their legal status. Some of the common problems that refugees or internally displaced women might face are sexual and gender-based violence, including rape, forced abortion, trafficking, sexual slavery, and the intentional spread of sexually transmitted infections, including HIV and AIDS. It is only recently that women's problems have been dealt with separately, and international guidelines have been issued by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees 1991. A separate handbook, I quote, UNHCR Handbook for the Protection of Women and Girls, unquote, 2008, focusing primarily on women and their betterment in the camps, have been formulated. While looking at the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugee Guidelines on the Protection of Refugee Women in 1991, refugees are people who are unable to or unwilling to return to their country of origin owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular group, or political opinion. The international community is confronted with the task of 1. Ensuring protection to refugees, and 2. To people who are uprooted from their homes and live in different localities within the territorial boundaries of a country. They are identified as internally displaced persons. Internally displaced persons are persons or groups who have been forced or obliged to flee or to leave their homes or places of habitual residence, in particular as a result of or in order to avoid the effects of armed conflict, situations of generalized violence, violations of human rights or natural or human-made disasters, and who have not crossed an internationally recognized state border. The Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, it requires protection because they become doubly disadvantaged, firstly because they are possible victims of the ethnic and civil wars and other acts of aggression, and secondly because they are outside their own countries and are unable to protect themselves as they could have in their own countries. The guidelines of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees have been divided into different sections. Section 1 identifies the areas the agency has to provide protection to refugee women. The guidelines take into account the vulnerability of women in conflict situations. Section 2 contains directions for evaluating the protection for refugees. Section 3 identifies 2 protection needs of refugee women, one physical security and the other legal problem. Section 4 suggests improvements that can be made in the guidelines to avoid abuse at the border. The guidelines accommodate rehabilitation and relief measures for the refugees. It incorporates the need for education of refugee children and development of income generation skills for refugee women. Section 5 of the guidelines outlines further actions to be undertaken once the protection of refugee women is dealt with. The UNHCR guidelines identifies the areas which require interventions. There are few areas for the intervention. The guidelines cite the necessity of incorporating women in decision making and skill developing programs. It takes special measures for refugee women crossing borders. Reuniting separated families forms one important task for the agency. It has made special provisions for assisting refugee women and single-headed women households to access food, water, firewood, health and shelter. It also assists women in registering for documents that are likely to be lost during flight. While assisting the refugee families and the women in particular, UNHCR tries to acquire an in-depth understanding of the conflict situations in the home country of refugee women. Number 1, they attempt to locate the immediate reasons for the flight from their home country to the asylum country and try to analyze the future possible movements of people from country to another. Number 2, UNHCR does not limit its operations only to emergency relief operations. It also tries to restore and help the refugee population adapt and develop coping strategies. For this, UNHCR attempts to understand the women's responsibilities and the role played by them prior to flight. The UNHCR has also noted that women are more vulnerable during flight and their stay in their refugee camps for the following reasons. A. Camps and security. Refugee women face danger due to A. Dilapidated conditions of the camps, B. Communal housing which does not provide any privacy for women, C. Location of bathing areas at an unsafe distance. The UNHCR guidelines seek to improve the housing conditions of refugee women. It also seeks to improve the structural conditions of the camps for example, the lighting of that site, proper security deployed to avoid protection issues. Camps often function as sites from where women are trafficked or are forced to become soldiers. The guideline stresses the necessity of counseling sessions and the immediate relocation of refugee women who are exposed to exploitation. Due to infrastructural inadequacies, women often fall prey to abduction, rape, and molestation. I quote, "Traditional mechanisms for protection of the vulnerable may be lost when refugees are forced to live in such camp surroundings. In particular, the communal support systems for protection of widows, single women, and unaccompanied girls are often no longer present. Aged and disabled are also particularly vulnerable." Unquote, UNHCR 1991. Prostitution is a frequently reported problem for most abundant and single-headed household women. Prostitution is often a result of the breakdown of the socio-cultural fabric of the society. The lack of money and the desire to be self-sufficient also forces women into prostitution. The guideline states that if alternative forms of income are not provided to them, prostitution will continue to be a frequent problem within the refugee population. B. Food distribution and health care. Women, including pregnant or lactating women, are at greater risk after flight. Usually, international organizations, in consultation with the male camp leaders who are generally unaware of the requirements of the women in the camps, distribute food and basic necessities. The guidelines suggest that refugee women should be consulted in matters regarding the kind of food required before distribution. It also stresses the need to, I quote, "monitor the nutritional status of women and children to identify problems in food distribution," unquote, UNHCR 1991. Any lapse in the nutritional level of the refugee woman would need the UNHCR officials to take immediate steps to review the food distribution policies. The guideline stresses the need of proper health care for women. Good health care also helps in identifying protection problems of women who have suffered rape and abuse. C. Access to education. An added problem that the refugee face is the lack of education. The access to education among women is worse. Hence, UNHCR seeks to ensure that refugee girls and boys have equal opportunities. Access to primary education with the aid of national scholarships would help to ensure implementation of developmental programs meant for women and girls. Such problems can be resolved with the involvement of refugee women. The guidelines state the necessity of incorporating the needs of refugee women while formulating any interventions to improve their security. UNHCR also takes into account the proper documentation and registration of refugee women for further help and assistance. The guidelines have become important as it raises within the UNHRC staff and partners about the security issues faced by refugee women and indicate ways of resolving the problems. One needs to keep in mind the fact that the guidelines were introduced after almost 3 decades of UNHCR's inception. Also, one must remember that in spite of the guidelines, incidents of violence amongst women or violence against women in conflict areas by the peacekeeping forces themselves have been reported. While looking into the Indian context, India is not new to the refugee problem. One of the largest human migrations known to history took place at the time of the birth of Pakistan, when India country was divided by the British in 2 countries. This mammoth migration of thousands of Hindus moving from what became Pakistan into India, and similarly thousands of Muslims moving into Pakistan from India, was accompanied by a bloodbath so horrible that almost 70 years later the tremors still resonate. The psychological and wounds of that time seem to have become permanent and erupt off and on till today. At the time of the birth of Bangladesh, too, India had aided Bangladesh in its fight for freedom, and after the formation of that country was left to cope with a massive refugee problem. Sri Lanka too has had thousands of its nationals cross over into India when civil war had broken out and the LTTE had announced a full-scale war against the Sri Lankan government. A substantial number of Tibetan nationals too have sought asylum in India, as border skirmishes between the Sino-Tibetan border take place frequently. The Indian borders are porous and crossovers from other countries are a routine matter. The UNHCR therefore has an important role to play in the country, which it does in collaboration with the government. The UNHCR's office, located in New Delhi, has a branch in Chennai, from where it deals with the Sri Lankan refugees, addressing the problems of repatriation and refugee status determination. Its officers have been approached by people ranging from countries as diverse as Myanmar, Afghanistan, Iraq and Somalia. The office also issues long-term visas, LTVs, which confer the right to work in the country to refugees. In India, UNHCR also works with several NGOs such as BOSCO, the Socio-Legal Information Center, the Gandhi National Memorial Society, the Confederation of Voluntary Agencies and Development and Justice Initiative DAJI, who play an essential role in the protection of refugees and asylum seekers. The works of the UNHCR cover wide-ranging services from education, health, legal counseling to giving vocational skills and helping with livelihood. Part of the work includes helping refugees with the process of returning to their own country, helping with the process of integration within the country as per the laws of the country for those who desire it, recommending sometimes the resettling in a third country when security is a special issue. The UNHCR serves as a platform for raising awareness through discussions and reaches out to professionals and members of civil society alike. It provides technical expertise to universities and research institutes and is involved in the postgraduate diploma in refugee law given by the Indian Society of International Law in New Delhi. The discussion also talks about the legal position. So while looking at the legal position, there is no national model law in India for granting statutory protection to refugees, although it has been on the anvil for some time. Such a law would set a procedure to be adopted for the granting of refugee status with its accompanying considerations. India, along with all other South Asian states, is not a party to the United Nations Conventions relating to the status of refugees 1951 Conventions and the protocol relating to the status of refugees of 1967 Protocol. However, the country claims that even without being a formal signatory, it has been sympathetic to refugee, although critics contend that the refusal lies in the financial commitment that goes along with signing the convention. In India, refugees are placed under three broad categories. Category 1, those refugees who receive full protection from the Indian government, like the Tamil refugees from Sri Lanka. Category 2, refugees are those who are granted refugee status by the UNHRC and are protected under the principle of non-refoulement, for example, the Burmese and the Afghan refugees. Although India is not a party to the 1951 Convention, it is bound by the international customary law principle of non-refoulement that prevents a country from expelling refugees to countries where their life and liberty are under serious threat. Category 3, these are the refugees who are neither recognized by the Indian government nor the UNHCR but have entered India and assimilated into the local community. For example, Chinese refugees from Burma living in the state of Mizoram. SAH RDC, Refugee Protection in India, October 1997. Thank you.